Get off my property right now." That is exactly what came out of my mouth the minute I pulled into my driveway and realized my grandfather's quiet little lake cabin had turned into a full-blown public park. There were folding tables lined up from my front steps down to the water, a giant grill blasting smoke straight at my windows, kids launching themselves off my dock, and my kayaks lined up like I was running a rental business, and I'm standing there in my dusty truck, holding my coffee, watching 12 strangers have the time of their lives on the one piece of earth that still felt like mine. And yeah, I kind of lost it. I'm Michael Parker. I work as a financial advisor in the city, which means a lot of fluorescent lights, a lot of people panicking over money, and way too much, staring at numbers that don't care how tired you are. This cabin, my grandfather built with his own hands back in the 60s, is the one place I have where none of that follows me. It's 2 hours out, half an acre of trees and grass, and this little dock that sticks into the lake like a finger. The water is so still in the morning it looks fake. He used to tell me, as long as you can stand on this dock, you're home. You know what I mean. Walking into a scene that looked like a corporate retreat blew a fuse in my brain. I slammed the truck door, yelled, "Everybody off the dock right now, this is private property," and it was like someone hit a mute button. Kids froze with water dripping off their hair. People turned around with that offended look. Strangers give you when you disturb their good time. A couple of lawn chairs creaked as people sat up and stared, like I was the problem. And then I saw her, the woman who was apparently running the show, standing in the middle of my lawn like she owned it. Navy blazer at the lake, heels on the grass clipboard, hugged to her chest. Silver bob perfectly in place. She looked like the president of something. And she walked toward me with that slow, controlled pace people use when they know everyone's watching. "Mr. Parker, I assume," she said, like we were in a meeting instead of on my front lawn. "I'm Victoria Sloan, president of the Lakeview Shores Homeowners Association." Then she flipped open that clipboard, pulled out a laminated sheet with an official-looking seal, and held it up between us. According to her, under some updated lakefront recreational reclassification policy that I had somehow never heard about, my shoreline was now shared community space on weekends. In the summer, she said these families had permits from the HOA. They'd paid for access, everything was fully compliant, and that my behavior, my yelling, was harassment, the kind of thing that could result in a formal complaint, and as if on cue, this older lady with a name tag that said Ashford stepped up with a stuffed envelope telling me they'd been planning this reunion since March, that they filed forms, paid fees, that they did everything right. Then unfolded emails, printed receipts, confirmation letters with my address written at the top like it was nothing. Around us, other people started holding up their phones, showing me strings of email threads with the HOA logo. Subject lines like, "Lakeview Shores, reservation confirmed. Lot 14 lakefront." One guy actually pointed at my dock in a photo from a previous summer and said, "We've used this spot before, it's in the system." I was so blindsided I just stood there. I told Victoria as calmly as I could that my grandfather had owned this land for 40 years, that I had the deed in my email, that this was not some shared park, and she just tilted her head with this patient little smile. "You give a child who doesn't get the rules. Regulations change, Mr. Parker," she said. "The HOA has worked closely with the county on these updates. Perhaps you haven't kept up with your mail." Then she added in that same calm tone, "If you continue screaming at families with valid permits, I'll have to call law enforcement and report you for harassment and interfering with HOA authority." I wish I could tell you I had some brilliant comeback, but in that moment, surrounded by strangers with paperwork and one very confident HOA president, I just felt myself sinking. I was furious, But I also had this tiny voice in the back of my head whispering, "What if she's right? What if you missed something?" When she actually dialed the sheriff's office, speaking clearly into the phone. "Yes, this is HOA President Sloan at Lakeview Shores. We have a property owner aggressively confronting permitted users." My stomach dropped through the floor. 20 minutes later, a dusty sheriff's cruiser rolled in, and out stepped Officer Dale Rochester, mid-40s mustache, relaxed. Stride, the first words out of his mouth were, "Hey, Victoria, another property confusion today," like they'd done this coffee chat a dozen times. He shook her hand, listened to her side first, flipped through her stack of laminated policies and permits, nodded along, then finally turned to me. I told him, "This is my land. I've got the deed in my email. My grandfather built this cabin." And he just kind of sighed, gave me that tired cop look, and started talking about how there had been a lot of regulatory changes, how the HOA was working with the county on shared access, how these folks weren't doing anything wrong. "You start yelling at grandmas and kids again, Mr. Parker. Now that's where we have a problem," he said, like I was some unstable guy on the verge of snapping and in front of everyone. I got handed this nice little warning that if I kept harassing permitted users, there might be charges, so I backed off. What else was I supposed to do? One HOA president with a stack of papers, a dozen neighbors with email confirmations, and a sheriff's deputy who nodded at every word she said. Versus me, and a deed no one seemed interested in seeing. I spent the rest of that afternoon sitting on the porch, watching people grill on my lawn and drink beer next to my boat. Shed kids running on my dock, while the lady in the blazer walked around directing everything like it was her show, and I was just some angry guy who happened to live nearby. That night, with the smell of charcoal still hanging in the cabin, I opened my laptop and started digging. I typed in every phrase she'd thrown at me. Lakefront recreational reclassification, shared community shoreline, Resolution 247B, Lakeview Shores, HOA County Environmental Partnership, and my screen filled up with PDFs and articles and statutes. Some of it was real. There were genuine things about environmental protections, public access, rights, corrections to old survey mistakes. Enough complicated language that if you weren't a lawyer, you could easily convince yourself you'd missed some big change. I scrolled and scrolled until my eyes ached, and that little voice got louder. "Maybe you were the one out of line. Maybe you're the guy screaming about rights you don't actually have anymore." Yeah, that thought sat in my chest like a rock. By about 3 a.m, I honestly felt sick this place. My grandfather had poured his weekends into hauling lumber and concrete. This dock, where he taught me how to tie a line, suddenly felt shaky, like someone might show up with a piece of paper and tell me none of it was really ours anymore, that I'd just been squatting on community property because I didn't read the fine print. The next morning, just when I was working up the nerve to call the county myself, that same squad car rolled into the driveway again. Only this time, there was also a newer SUV with it out. Stepped Officer Rochester and a woman with sergeant stripes on her sleeve. She introduced herself as Sergeant Williams, opened a thick notebook, and without much preamble, started reading from a formal complaint filed by the HOA, according to that report. I had yelled, "Get off my property right now," in an aggressive manner. At elderly residents and children refused to examine valid permits and continued confrontational behavior even after regulations were patiently explained by the HOA president. Standing there, listening to my worst 5 seconds replayed, as a pattern of harassment was like getting punched in the gut. And then she shifted into this calm, clinical tone and asked if there had been any major stress in my life. any mental health concerns, because the HOA president had expressed worries about my ability to understand my property rights and remain calm. Which is a very nice way of saying, we think this guy might be unstable. You know what I mean. In less than 48 hours, I'd gone from guy who owns the lake cabin to possible danger to the community. On paper, one loud moment. One carefully written complaint, and I was suddenly walking a line where raising my voice could mean charges. And I'll be honest, that messed with my head, because when people with badges and clipboards say you're the problem, you start wondering if maybe they're seeing something you're not. After they left with their warnings and their notes, my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Fairchild, wandered over from the blue cottage down the shore. She's one of those sweet older ladies who bakes too much and always has a cardigan on. She patted my hand and said, "I'm sure this will all blow over, dear. It was good that Victoria scheduled the site inspection last weekend, while your car was gone, made everything much smoother." I just stared at her and asked, "What inspection?" And she told me like it was the most normal thing in the world that Victoria had been out here, with some people from the HOA walking my lot planning for community access, and that she'd mentioned how my place is usually empty anyway. So it was perfect for these events. That was the moment the fog in my brain started to burn off. How did the HOA president know exactly when I was gone? Why was she doing inspections of my property without talking to me? Why did all of this feel less like governance and more like a takeover? Monday morning at 8 on the dot. I called the county, no HOA, no Victoria, just straight to the people whose names are actually printed on ordinances. I asked them about Resolution 247B, shared lakefront access, about any partnership with Lakeview Shores, and on the other end of the line there was this pause. Then the woman said, "We don't have any active ordinance numbered 247B. Those numbers were phased out in a code reorganization years ago. Planning and zoning told me there was no program to reclassify private lakefront lots as shared amenities. No new department with the fancy name Victoria had dropped, and absolutely no record of a special agreement with my HOA. When I asked if they knew of Victoria Sloan, they checked their notes and said they'd only ever heard that name in complaint calls, not in any official capacity. So now I had a different picture forming. Not a confusing mess of regulations I'd failed to understand, but a woman with a title and a clipboard who was counting on everybody else being too scared or too tired to check if she actually had the authority she claimed. I'm a financial advisor. My whole job is sniffing out bad paperwork and protecting people from slick talkers with impressive-looking documents. So once that idea clicked, I went to the one witness she couldn't tamper with anymore: my cameras. She'd tried my main hard drive was corrupted. One cable had been tugged just enough to kill power. Very neat, very intentional. But I set that system up with off-site backup every night. Compressed footage uploaded with timestamp. Not pretty, but it was there, and when I scrolled back a few weeks, it felt like I was watching behind-the-scenes footage of a con. There was Victoria walking my property line, with a guy in a cheap polo and a camera pointing out my dock, my trees, my shed. Speaking into a handheld recorder later, I saw her slip into my unlocked shed, standing in front of my electrical panel and security box, tracing cables with her fingers taking pictures. She was casing my place like a burglar who also happened to run the HOA. Then I hit the clip from 5 days before the family reunion. She was standing on my dock with the same guy water calm behind them, and the mic picked up her voice clear as day. She was saying, "Make sure the families know they're getting exclusive access. We give them realistic permits. We show them the HOA logo by the time the owner figures out the papers are fake. We've got him on record, yelling at kids and arguing with the HOA president and a friendly officer. No one listens to him after that, the guy asked. What happens if I called the real county? And she said, by the time he does that, we'll already have complaints filed and maybe a harassment charge property owners who fight. This don't get second chances. And I just sat there on my couch laptop open, listening to this woman describe step by step how she planned to turn me into the villain on my own land. And that shame I'd been carrying around flipped into something else, something cold and sharp. I wasn't confused anymore. I was being played. I called my cousin Stephanie. She's a paralegal in the state capitol. I sent her pictures of the permits, the seals, the HOA headers. From those emails my neighbors showed me, she called back almost immediately and said, we had a case like this a few months ago. Different county, different HOA name. Same style of fake documents, same kind of fake environmental compliance fees. The woman running it disappeared before they could arrest her. She put me in touch with Detective Natalie Cross from the state's financial crimes unit. And the minute I mentioned fake permits, reclassification fees, a helpful local officer, and a pattern of targeting lakefront owners, who didn't come up much, she said, if you're willing to let this play out a little longer, we can do more than just make her leave your property. So that night, I turned my grandfather's cabin into a trap. I reconnected everything, installed new cameras, and hidden audio in the living room. And on the porch, made sure every angle of that coffee table was covered. And right on time, my phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Mr. Parker, we need to schedule a mandatory compliance review for your lot. Tuesday at 2 p.m. will work. We'll discuss remediation fees and your future responsibilities. I replied, I'll be here. She showed up right at 2 alone. Same blazer. Thicker folder. Same confident little smile. I played the part of the defeated homeowner, invited her in. Poured coffee. Let her sit exactly where the audio was best. She spread out documents like a dealer, explaining that my lot was compliance with HOA environmental and access rules, that officially there was a remediation fee of $1,500. But if I could bring $3,000 in cash, she could handle it internally. No liens, no reports, no more inspections. She talked about wanting to protect me from bigger consequences, about how owners who cooperate have a much easier time, dropped lines about how Officer Rochester understands how sensitive these situations are. And I just kept nodding, asking questions, letting her talk herself into a corner, every word recorded. When I told her I didn't have $3,000 in cash on hand, and asked if we could meet the next morning at 10 to settle everything. She thought for a second, then smiled and said, of course I'll bring your completion certificates once you pay. This will all be behind you. What she didn't know was that Detective Cross and 2 state troopers would be parked just down the road waiting for my signal. 10 o'clock the next morning, a silver sedan and a black SUV rolled into my drive. This time, Victoria brought backup. The guy from the footage showed up in a wrinkled suit, calling himself a compliance supervisor. They came in, spread a fresh set of papers across my table this time, including these long recreational access agreements that would basically turn my shoreline into a permanent HOA-run amenity. They bragged about their program, how many families they had, how they'd done this with other properties, how much easier it was when owners stopped fighting. And I let them talk, let them lay out exactly how they make money renting out land they don't own. Finally, Victoria tapped the plain envelope I'd placed in the middle of the table. So, Mr. Parker, are we ready? $3,000 in cash and we can close your file. My heart was hammering. but I kept my voice steady. What? Yeah, we're done, and slid it over. She opened it, expecting money, and instead pulled out Detective Cross's card and a printed line that said, "This meeting is being recorded by the State Financial Crimes Unit." Her face drained. The guy in the suit muttered something I probably can't repeat here, and right then there was a knock at the door. I just said, "Come in." Detective Cross walked in, badge flashing calm. "As you please," 2 troopers right behind her. She looked at the papers on my table, the recorder, the envelope, then at Victoria. "Good morning, Ms. Sloan," she said. "We've got a lot to talk about." Victoria tried to spin it. Said it was just an internal HOA issue. Said I'd invited them over to settle a fee that I must have misunderstood. But Cross started listing things off. No such ordinance at the county level. No such department. No authority for the HOA to do what she claimed. Then mentioned the surveillance footage, the fake seals, the audio of yesterday's meeting, where she talked about paying an officer a consultation fee. And the whole room shifted. You could feel it like gravity realigning. They cuffed both of them in my living room, right where a few days earlier I'd been sitting feeling like maybe I was just crazy and difficult. The neighbors came out again to see what the flashing lights were about. This time, they watched their perfectly polished HOA president getting walked to a cruiser in handcuffs, and Miss Fairchild stood at the edge of her yard, looking absolutely heartbroken, softly, shaking her head. And yeah, part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt angry. It had gone this far. Part of me just felt exhausted. I don't know how the courts are going to shake out for them yet. Investigations like this stretch out, and I'm sure I'll be called to testify to explain why I hit record instead of just writing a check. But standing on that porch, watching those cars drive away, I felt something I hadn't felt since before this whole mess started. Like the ground under my feet actually belonged to me again. So let me throw this back to you. If you were my neighbor and you'd only seen the first part, me yelling her holding papers, the cop siding with her, whose side would you have been on? Would you have thought classic angry homeowner, or would you have smelled something off? And if your HOA president showed up with fancy documents and a friendly officer and told you your property rights had changed, would you have had the energy to fight it, or would you have paid just to make the headache go away? You know what I mean. Tell me in the comments if you think I went too far setting up that sting or not far enough. And if you've ever dealt with someone hiding behind a title and a clipboard to push regular people around. I want to hear about it. Hit. Like, share this with that one friend who hates their HOA, and let me know down below when authority shows up at your door looking official. Do you automatically trust them, or do you ask to see who actually signed the paperwork?